My name is Josh Pattison. I'm the Development Manager, Community Outreach Coordinator at Barrios Unidos. As a student at BCSC, and it's been an amazing 2 years, starting as a prison project intern, and now being given this responsibility and amazing opportunity to be a part of the development of this property. And like Nani said, we need to keep our human resource, but beyond that, I think what we're trying to do is create a national model for community development, where it's not just housing, where people are able to engage with this space and create ideas and art and community with each other. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to introduce Geoffrey Morgan. Geoffrey Morgan, President and Chief Executive Officer. CHISPA is responsible for the overall operations, strategic growth, and advocacy for CHISPA in its service to low and moderate income households across Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Benito counties. Mr. Morgan has over 20 years of experience in housing development and ownership for a variety of income levels and populations. He most recently was president and CEO of the First Community Housing for almost a decade and was a leader in sustainable development of affordable housing in Silicon Valley and surrounding areas. Prior to this, Mr. Morgan was vice president of real estate development for CCH, a national leader in the production of low-income affordable housing for older Americans. Geoffrey is involved in numerous policy and community initiatives to support affordable housing, such as the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, Leading Age, the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and the California Coalition for Rural Housing. Mr. Morgan holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and a master's degree in real estate development from MIT. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Geoffrey Morgan.
Thank you, and that concludes my presentation. I think there's a slideshow in there, if I'm not mistaken. We'll see if we can find it. Yep, there it is. So that's a picture of Alfred Diaz-Infante Apartments. It was named after my predecessor, who passed tragically, but he had 25 years of service. It's been a real blessing over the last 6 months to work at CHISPA. Next slide, please. So that's more me. I think we've had enough of the biographies, so I'll just say this. Oh, go back, I had one more thing. A couple of examples of work I've done in this county. Upper left-hand, that's Garfield Park Village. So I was involved with the whole rehabilitation of that in the Circles neighborhood. The one below is one that David Foster is very familiar with. That's Bay Avenue Senior Apartments in Capitola. We drove up to the state treasurer's office together to see if we could, was it for state home funds? David, is that what we're doing? Okay, so we got a renovation and increased the number of units and decreased the consumption of water for the Soquel Creek Water District. And finally, I'm standing with several attractive people over at Villa La Posada. That's at the Pajaro-Watsonville border. That's the one community, and I'd love to build more, in Santa Cruz County that CHISPA manages. Next slide. So our experiences, we've built, CHISPA has been around for about 44 years. We've created 2,500 units of housing. 1,500 of those are rental. 300 of the rental are senior housing projects. We serve roughly 4,000 residents every day. Next slide. Oh, and I should say also, we are our own general contractor and our own property manager. So we have Central Coast Residential Builders and CHISPA Management, Property Management. This is a picture of a party we had at Sherwood Village in Salinas with our folklorico dancers. I'm not one of the folklorico dancers, but this is sort of an example of the partnerships. We have about 50 different service agencies we work with all of our communities to really improve the quality of life. And one of the gentlemen standing next to me, who's in his 70s, is a folklorico dancer. He had so much fun there that he started dancing with the dancers while we were having fun at the senior community. We had also folks from the team leadership council that we're serving. So that's a really major part of making community successful. It's not just creating a structure. And I think that's a real advantage that nonprofit, mission-oriented nonprofits have. It's not just about the dollar, it's really about the quality of life. Next slide. This is where we're located. You'll notice the one community in Santa Cruz at the top in Watsonville, Santa Cruz County. 32 communities that we're managing, and a lot of self-help housing and for sale housing that's not shown on the map. Next slide. So this is a story that came out on KION on Christmas Day on December 25th. And there's three things that are my favorite things about this work. One is the handshake where we begin a partnership to start building. The second part is actual construction. I love watching the buildings go up. My favorite part is really handing out the keys. And the people that you see in this picture, Irma and Alberto, have a family of 8, and they were living in Watsonville in a garage. And if you see the story, it's on news. I didn't know if we'd be able to have YouTube pop up here, but it's pretty intense. That was the best week I've had so far at CHISPA because we housed 8 people. There are 66 units at Alfred Diaz and Park Infante Apartments. The next day, we housed a family of 7 that was living in a condemned 1-bedroom trailer in Moss Landing. It was condemned. They would have to have moved out before the end of the year. Fortunately, they were able to move into an apartment. And what I try not to think about is of those 66 units, we had 1,800 applications for families and folks who wanted to move in. So I try to take satisfaction in the people that we are able to help. Next slide. So I was at a council meeting, we were celebrating Braceros, and one of the gentlemen, I introduced myself, I was just starting a few months back, and he said, "Hey, I'm Jeff, I'm with CHISPA." And so I got a tap on the shoulder from Tony Vargas. Tony is working at Blue Zones, and he does healthcare. He learned it as he was taking care of his father, Daniel, who was a bracero, who was fortunate enough to become a citizen, and he was also fortunate enough that he was picked to build some self-help housing with a cadre of another 6 families. They helped each other through a year of weekends to build their own homes with our assistance. And so he was able to create a place where they got healthier. He had to deal with type 2 diabetes as a bracero. He dealt with effects from tuberculosis that he had when he was cramped in with the other farm workers that had come over from Mexico. Afibrilla and other things that they found out about a lot later. And that's where his son learned a love of trying to care for others. And so now he's over at Blue Zones helping other people create healthy environments. So this home was a platform for them to thrive and for his family to grow and be of service. Next slide. So in Santa Cruz County, who qualifies? You've got, these are some of the median incomes with a family of 3. You think about farm workers, because we'll serve folks generally, they're 60% or 30% area median income. And think about hospitality workers, the folks that serve you coffee in the morning, somebody who might be helping as first responders. Next slide. Traditionally, we use something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Essentially, it's a program that's been in place since Ronald Reagan, believe it or not, 1986. But it's a way of building public-private partnerships. It's the most successful housing program in U.S. history. Over 8 million people are housed because of this program every day in the U.S. And it's got, the way it works is we build housing that has lower rents. So we have one community that we're finishing, we've got approvals on for seniors that's going to have rents from $600 a month to $1,200 a month, which is something someone can actually afford if they're on SSA. How do you do that? Well, you can't pay for the mortgage with it, so we get government subsidies. We have the tax credits that come from banks trying to reverse the effects of not investing in communities because of redlining through something they call the Community Reinvestment Act. They invest in tax credits. Then you have the loans that you can get, whatever you can pay for. And whatever's left, you have to go to the government or a private entity. And those are, what I call them, they're called soft debt, and that's kind of like a loan from your mother. What it means is that you only pay it back if you have some money to pay it back with. They don't foreclose on you. And we also get things like subsidies from the housing authority. So this is the traditional multifamily rental that's worked all over the country for over 40, well, almost 40 years. Next slide. This is the housing. So you think about Mr. Vargas, he was in a 502 USDA self-help housing. There's both self-help where they do work like Habitat for Humanity where you put in sweat equity. There's also just direct mortgages. And this is a technique for, and I personally think that if you're maybe at a little higher income where you can afford the mortgage and the insurance, this is an opportunity to reverse some of the redlining and discrimination against persons of color where they didn't have the chance to build equity. Because how many of us really funded our kids' education because of their homes, or funded a business because of their homes? And so we're actively trying to build some houses over in Castroville on a site we've tried to build for about 20 years now, but I think we're hopefully getting a lot closer. Next slide. So how are we doing as a region? If you look at the numbers that AMBAG puts out, the Monterey Bay Area governments, it says that we are falling behind every year on our low income and very low income in Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Benito counties by over 1,000 units. We're only building about 200 to 300. And I think this was back in 2022, and there's been some strides in Santa Cruz because of Pacific North and South and some of the work at the library. But nonetheless, usually throughout that whole region, we're only looking at something around 200 or 300 units of housing, rental housing every year. And even if you looked at the fair share of what we ought to be getting as a percentage of population for the whole state from tax credits, it should be much higher, at least in the 400s. And the reason I think it's different is because we need to pass some bond measures. We're competing with large cities, other cities, that bring in their own dollars. And if they do that, they're more competitive for the funding. So if you're in Los Angeles or San Francisco or one of these bigger cities. So passing bond measures here makes a big difference in trying to create this housing. And so that's just a very rough picture of this. Next slide. So here's how I look at it. It's a big elephant, and I take one bite at a time. So we think about how do we deal with it now? There's density. Density costs money. Now, I definitely heard what Julie was saying. I will say this. If I build something lower density, I don't get as much. Maybe I'm able to build it less expensively and more quickly, possibly. And so there's immediate needs. And so it just depends on where you are. Building a parking garage costs about $70,000 a space if you're building the concrete podium and then building the housing above it. And if you go substructure, it's $100,000 a unit. So picture an underground parking garage. That's probably old numbers. And the numbers keep going up. We're in a case right now where we're dealing with budget deficits and billions of dollars. And so what we're trying to do is be very intentional and selective about what we build and trying to be realistic so we can be good stewards and keep serving our own residents as well. So a lot of folks are getting pretty stretched, and with the budget cuts, it's gotten really tough. Next slide, please.
That's a printed home.
What's that?
It's a printed home.
Oh, on the other printed homes and modular homes? Yeah, so we're looking at different creative technologies. I talked to somebody who's literally creating printed homes out of recycled plastic. You could pull them from the Pacific Garbage Patch, and the Pacific Plastic Patch, whatever that's called. Did I say that right? I think I said that right. Anyway, you could actually create modules and put them together like Legos. I've done modular building. It was some of the hardest project I ever worked on, but we housed 155 formerly unhoused in San Jose because of it. So there's different technologies where we can possibly speed the project process, but you have to determine whether you want to be on the leading edge of technology or the leading edge of technology. Sometimes there's some risk associated with it. So, but we are looking at different ways to streamline things. We're looking at ways maybe not to have to use tax credits because there's such restrictions on state budgets. So we're just trying to get really creative. Yes?
In Texas, they literally are using like 3D
Yes.
printers, which I actually oppose because then it's all single family residence.
Right, and so modules are easy if you're doing a single family. If you're stacking them, then you have to create a new structure, and I've seen several modular housing groups go out of business, which is really hard if you're trying to be predictable, because I have to make bets 4, 5, 6 years ahead of time that something's going to be able to work later on, and so you want somebody who's a reliable partner. Yet there are some modular groups that are still around and actually quite reliable. Yeah, they've been around for decades. Okay, and then, yeah, and what I want to say is it's really hard, but you know, I was thinking about my visit. Nane changed my life, you didn't even know maybe, but we visited Soledad, and I met some of the most real people I've ever seen, and you think about the potential that they have. You know, we talk about a lot of the reason we have high costs is we don't have construction labor, and yet there are folks who are getting trained. Maybe there are ways for them to fabricate some of these modules. There are actually organizations working with them in Soledad to begin doing that and saving money, setting money aside for them later when they get out. Are there ways for CHISPA to work with their subs to employ folks like this instead of having higher recidivism rates? And the fellow below is somebody who is at a place called Rancho Cielo in Monterey. And Rancho Cielo was a boys' camp, and now it is a place for an alternative high school where people learn all kinds of skills, in this case, construction trades. So they built this group of high school kids with good help from very innovative folks, modular housing, and Matt's very aware of this, been very involved in it, that they shipped to Orange County to participate in the Sustainability Decathlon, highly environmentally sustainable, and they reassembled them, pitched their idea to 10,000 people who walked through the units, and they won. And they're high school students competing with a university from China, and everyone else was a university, and 3 of those were CHISPA House residents. So I'm really proud of that. So is it worth it? Absolutely. I'll put one key at a time to the door, and I'm very grateful to be of service.
Is that one of the houses? Is that the house?
Yeah, so the fellow below is named Josue, and Josue is going to be a physics major later on, but he was one of the people who helped design and build those houses.
Is that an example of their house right there?
Yes, we're standing in it. We're standing in it. All right, and I guess we just move on to the next person, right? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next up we have Matt Huerta. He has over 23 years of experience in affordable housing and community development. He has developed hundreds of affordable homes, both rental and for sale, in the Sacramento, San Francisco Bay, and Monterey Bay areas. He serves in several leadership roles, including as the Director of Northern California for Path Ventures, as Housing and Community Development Director for the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and on the core statewide campaign team to lower the voter threshold and expand allowable uses for local housing measures. He has led nationally recognized housing programs, including a HUD-certified counseling agency and Fannie Mae First Mortgage Seller and Servicer as the former Executive Director of Neighborhood Housing Services Silicon Valley. Matt serves on the boards of the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California Action Fund and the California Coalition for Rural Housing. All right, let's give it for Matt.
Appreciate it. All right. Yes, you can be my marketing PR person anytime. So I just have a few slides, but I really am excited to be here, not only for the panel here. It's great to see Julie. She mentioned a few things, gave me a little bit, bless you. I was triggered when she was talking about Felton, and we can talk about that now or later, and that's what she was talking about a few years back, when there was redevelopment agency funds, and there really was another nonprofit called South County Housing that was, and I was project manager and development director there at one point. The quick story is, because I'm triggered, so you're gonna have to deal with this for 30 seconds, is it was an amazingly contentious entitlement process, right? We have ideas, we engage the community, we work in partnership with the community to try to craft a plan. She mentioned the plan. It had senior housing, it had for sale housing, very cutting edge stuff at the time. We were invited by the county to pursue that project. And then the neighborhood came out and viciously basically killed it. And it was one of the learnings I said, and one thing that just really stays with me to this day from some of the conversations I had. I was in the back of the room. I was one of the only people of color in that conversation, and I will remember this forever. Somebody basically stood up during the Q&A session and said, well, we don't want little Watsonville over here. And not only did that sting, right, as somebody who's a Chicano Latino community leader here, but just as, and my background as an affordable housing resident, first 5 years of my life, I lived in affordable housing. So it penetrates to the bone for me. And I remember crying. I was so pissed off. And I didn't know what to say because any words that would come out of my mouth were not going to be very pleasant. And I was going to be that angry brown kid, right? And so just a reminder that, you know, those of us that are in this space around advocacy, around affordable housing development, this is very real, right? This is very real work that we're doing to try to, as someone else said earlier, to try to unwind decades, if not centuries, of ingrained, you know, racism and other isms that we deal with, right? So let's not forget that that's really part of what is important to lift up during this month, is all the work that we're doing is, you know, very powerfully resisting against these other entrenched, powerful interests. And to me, that's what my work and career has been since the beginning. I was a student activist at Davis, and I figured out, oh, you know, what am I can't get, is anybody hiring me to be a student activist? You know, maybe, but I had to figure out what my career path was going to be. And fortunately, I found affordable housing as a vocation through an internship program. And so fast forward 23 years, I now have my own consulting practice, and I am fortunate and blessed to take on the fights that I feel like I can contribute to and where I want to be. So I'm based in Salinas, but I work across the Central Coast here in the Monterey Bay area, and I do a lot of work in Silicon Valley. I see Catherine over there. We worked on the project in the last few years as well, before you retired, and for people assisting the homeless out of LA. I do a lot of housing in San Jose and Silicon Valley, taking on the homelessness issue. So I just kind of go from one kind of big fight to the next. And I think what Julie was saying really resonated really with me too. She's like, okay, what's the fight now, right? Like, you know, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have structural problems. We have been working for, since it was mentioned by my colleague here, Jeff, that we started to have an amazing effort of trying to solve the affordable housing crisis in 1986 or whatever it was. But what happened was that they sold us a bag of tricks that was basically for the market rate, for a private enterprise to solve affordable housing. They said, let's create this amazing program to give rich people more money called the tax credit program. 40 years later, yes, it has produced the most, but we're only talking serving, how many did you say, 8 million? How many, tell me how many people live in the United States of America again?
300.
So we're talking a fraction. We would be leaps and bounds ahead if we would save the bombs that we're dropping on people's heads and invest even a fraction of that money in affordable freaking housing. Right? It's just truly disgusting, especially now we're seeing just the intense destruction that we're seeing, right? And it hurts, it hurts. And so the work that I'm doing, you know, these slides don't even matter to me anymore. So I'm fortunate, a few years ago, I was trying to figure out what my role was going to be in terms of crafting my own business plan. And I did run into Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and they're an amazing organization. This organization is probably the only organization that truly works across the whole region and takes on the biggest challenges that surface as the CEOs of the largest corporations, which include the counties, right? Because we're kind of a rural-ish, suburban-ish, some urban edge to us, but government accounts for about 50% of all the economic activity. In Santa Cruz County, the biggest employer is UCSC, right? And the biggest private enterprises in our regions typically are either the schools or the hospitals. So we're talking about making sure that we have the major employers tend to have a public benefit edge to them. which I think is really strong for us, right? That gives me a lot of hope that, you know, the healthcare system, education, you know, the systems that we have here, if we work together, and if we can find common cause, we can solve big problems. We can make big strides, whether it's housing or elsewhere. And so housing has been one of the key issues that has come up and over again. When I first started my career in the late 90s, early 2000s, housing was barely maybe top 10, barely. Over the years, I think, especially during the recession, it became number one. And then every couple of years, they'd say, well, what's the number one issue? Now we all have to just read the paper. What's the number one issue? Housing, 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 housing. But we are 40 years deep into this thing, and I'm really, really scared. Gotta tell you, because if we're fighting over the food bin projects of the world, and if we're gonna fight over every dang project, we are not only losing, but we are gonna just get destroyed by this thing. So we have to stop fighting over that's good enough, right? That's good enough to at least go in the direction of solving the problems. Nothing's ever going to be perfect for me, for you, but it's going to have to be good enough so that we can start making a dent in this thing, right? And so that's really what MBEP's Housing Initiative for All is about, is making sure that we have advocacy and education. We're taking on the projects and policies that are going to start to move the needle. I don't take on every single ADU, right? I'm taking on where can we actually start meeting the regional housing needs? What are those 100s, 200s? What are those master plan, you know, let's expand the downtown. Let's build on the corridors. What are those, you know, vehicle mile traveled reducing projects that we can really get behind, right? And it's not going to be perfect. No one, just like Julie, bless her heart, you know, someone else mentioned to me, I remember, I'll share this too, a few months, maybe a year ago, that really resonated. It's like, we act like cars have more rights than people sometimes. Shame on us. Shame on us, right? Like, let's elevate the needs of humanity above vehicles, right? Let's get there. We need to be that. The Monterey Bay Housing Trust is about getting the tech funds that are just over the hill into our community. And so we have now invested about $25 million since the last 6 years in this community that either wasn't going to happen or wasn't going to happen fast enough. And so we've done 10 loans, and there's been 600 or 700 units that have helped with early project work. We know, those of us that are in housing development know that it's super expensive and hard to acquire the property. It's super hard to like craft a plan. You have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for architects and engineers. You know, Nani's back there. Yeah, I know. He signed those checks for his homies to do the design work, right? It's endless and it's super expensive, but those are the necessary pieces. So you need to have early money that's patient capital that, as someone else mentioned earlier, maybe your mom is gonna not come asking for it. So that's what we do. The last piece is employer-sponsored housing. That's where, because MBEP is who they are, it represents a lot of the CEOs and other leadership across the county. We say, look, yes, you want us to do something, but you have to do something too. You have to actually put some treasure behind this. You actually maybe have to show up to some of these hearings, right? You have to put some political capital to this solution. And so that's where I think MBEP, again, is uniquely positioned to play that role. That's why I've been with them for 6 or 7 years. And I'm going to continue to support them, whether paid or not, because I think that we need that kind of entity supporting, you know, all of our efforts for housing. Next. So this is just a quick thing around the loans that I mentioned. Next. And then, you know, just reminder that it's not only the education, hospitality is major here, obviously, especially in Santa Cruz County. Agriculture, doing right by our farm workers. Has anybody seen recently in the paper about Half Moon Bay?
Yeah.
Holy crap. So I'll tell you, I've had a front row seat on that. So I'm an advisor to that project, and I will tell you, and I've been here in Santa Cruz, and when people ask me, Matt, what is the toughest, you know, NIMBY, I'm like, usually Santa Cruz is actually one of my, I love y'all, but sometimes some of the not in my backyard stuff that goes on here, y'all, I've been here past midnight for some of these hearings, right, in previous years and stuff. But this Half Moon Bay thing is for real. This is a 100% project, and farm workers that were devastated by the shooting that we all know happened last year, and yet people are still diabolically, strategically committed to using the laws that are in place to protect our coastline, which I am for. We are all for that. We want our scenic views. We want our pristine, sanctuary that the bay is, all those things. But this thing's not on the damn ocean. This thing is in downtown Half Moon Bay, where there's 3 or 4 transit lines, where there's a building across the street that's 40 feet high. We're asking for 50 feet, but they'd act like we're asking for 100 or 1,000 feet. So my point is, this goes back to the whole point of like, we gotta lean forward. If you're truly for affordable housing, and I will, anybody, we have to lean forward. When I start hearing people like, basically leaning back, but what about parking, what about, I'm starting to hear you lean back. And I get it, because those are real concerns. But leaning forward means, how can we make this work? How can I maximize parking here? How can I do some rideshare programs? How can I partner with other folks to mitigate the issues that we know are going to be there? But those issues do not compare to the needs of the farm worker families, the people that have lived in that community for 40 or 50 years and continue to provide us food security, and then we can't do them right by creating affordable housing in a community where it's supposed to be. That's right. We got to do better, y'all. So, next. So how much more time I got? You're gonna cut me off in a minute, right?
You got like
5 minutes. Okay, so that's all I need for this one. This is gonna be easy, y'all. This is easy. Who votes in here? Who votes? Oh, we got some voters, y'all. You guys are active. This is good. This is my people right here. Okay, all right. Because we do other stuff too, but at least you gotta vote, right? You gotta vote at least. So I'm excited because I was invited to a table a couple of years ago now. It's been a couple of years in the making. It was going on way before me. But there was this effort to try to make it easier to pass local measures. And this came about after what Julie was mentioning, right? She said, look, I used to have, this county used to have $8 million every year. That doesn't sound like that much. If you're in development, I'm like, hey man, whatever. It's $50 million here. But $8 million, that basically means about 2 to 3 projects a year. That means those 2 or 3 projects can actually move forward and start to get more state money. Because you're not going to do it just with $8 million. Every project that you ever see out there that's especially deeply affordable housing, trust me, they leverage that $8 million 4, 5, 10 times over. Okay? But that's what the county was able to do because it had a local resource. And so that's what we need to do again, because we basically gave up. We've been trying for years to we need a new redevelopment agency. We're gonna do. It's not gonna happen, y'all. We need to pivot. We need to find something else. So one of the something else's is what this is about. Californians for Affordable Housing Now. The idea is to basically make a democratic play, because what happened in Santa Cruz County cannot happen ever again. In 2018, the county pulled together an amazing coalition, very cross-sectional, very strong. Some of y'all were in this room. We pulled together a great campaign. It would have raised $140 million for affordable housing across the county. The goal was, and it would have produced, probably maybe by now, would have actually helped about 1,000 new homes of affordable housing across the county. And it went to the voters and it missed it. It got about 55% countywide, which is a pretty good majority, right? But it needed 66%. And so, unlike San Francisco, other parts of the Bay, they've been able to do that in previous times, in Santa Clara County as well. Even Santa Clara County, even other places across the Bay said, you know what, we're probably not going to be able to do that again, because people are really concerned, rightfully so, about where their tax dollars are going, and they want accountability. All those things are right, so we're not probably going to get 66%. We can get 55%. We can maybe even get 60%. But we need the voter threshold lowered. And actually, the schools, if you all remember this, Prop 39 back in 2000 did this successfully. Before that, only about 50, maybe 51% of school bonds passed. What percentage is it now? Since 2000, anybody want to guess what percentage of school bonds, when they're put on the ballot, tend to pass now?
80.
Since then?
80.
Over 80%. You want to come up here?
Tell us.
Right? But it's true. You have to mess this up. because everybody knows, right, how much investment really needs to happen there. And by the time you get organized and get to that point, like, hey, those schools need an upgrade, y'all. You see what's going on here, right? And so same thing with housing. We're at that point where we need those bold investments, and the local governments can pull together, can customize their local measures to meet the needs, whether it's farm worker housing here, homelessness over there, home ownership, whatever might be the need in those communities across the 450 some odd communities that we have across California. This measure on the November ballot, which is, we're headed that way. There's some things we need to do right now to tighten things up, but we're headed toward the November ballot. Please join me in supporting that. I will be reaching out to you. If I don't have your email or your phone number yet, I know Nane can get it from you, because that's going to be one of my top dogs on this thing. So next, I think I mentioned all this stuff already. Next. Good enough. Next. Okay, yeah. So then there's the website. You can look more. It's very bare bones right now, but over the next few weeks and months, you're going to see a lot more on that. There's going to be promotional material. My role on there is to help stitch together the statewide campaign of housing coalitions. So I'm with San Diego. I'm trying to get LA folks, even Central Valley, Sacramento, where we kind of know where we probably don't have that much support, but the goal is not to lose there as bad. Right? Those of you who are in electoral politics know that if at least you can get carved into some of those areas, right? Like even Orange County, otherwise, what I've learned in some of the polling and data that we've done is, yes, we can kind of count on the Democratic Party to a certain degree, but we still need to drive them out. And we know the landscape in November is going to be really bad, right? We know that the Trump supporters are going to be out there. We know that the messaging is going to be really cloudy. We got to be able to penetrate through everything else that's going to be on the ballot. There's going to be about 14 to 15 different other measures, some of which will be in line with this, kind of housing justice movement. Others are not. So we need to sort through all that together. So I'm really excited about it. I know that I'm here for questions as well. And Catherine has a quick question, or do you want to wait?
I was just going to say that Howard Jarvis thing that would be exact opposite is going to be on the November ballot too, because that's going to be very confusing.
The CBRT measure?
Where they're trying to get rid of the court ruling that said if you have a voter-approved initiative, which is I think how Santa Cruz just got theirs passed.
Yeah.
It was voter, right?
Right.
If it's a voter initiative as opposed to a council measure, it only has to have the simple majority.
Right. Yeah. So there's an effort right now.
That is, if that's on the same ballot as this, I think it's going to be very confusing.
It's going to be crazy. So what Catherine's talking about is the California Business Roundtable has sponsored and this is like all the who's who, right? Big Tech, Chevron, everybody, they're on that. And they're basically saying, big banks too, Wells Fargo, whatever, some friends, some enemies, whatever. They are saying that they're going to fully fund this thing to try to basically wipe out all these local investments that have been already approved by voters, and even in recent years and going forward. So what Speaker Rivas has done and others have basically said, look, if you want to have everything passed by a 2/3 majority, your measure has to pass by 2/3. And so that's AC 813. So that's part of what's going against that. And obviously this is going to have a big target on it. So we're also very concerned because whether we win that in court or not, there's already kind of a treasure trove and interests that are there to try to peel this back. So we're actually in the throes of trying to negotiate with the realtors, with the California Chamber of Commerce and others to kind of get behind this effort, because again, they know that they have to do something about affordable housing.
Yeah.
And why I think this can still pass this year is because we know that there's about a $45 billion budget deficit, but the governor and all the legislators, Assembly and Senate, still want something to happen on housing and win. And this is a non-budgetary ask. This is something that will not affect the state budget and could actually be something that is still voluntary. We're not saying you have to do this. This just allows local governments and local communities like Santa Cruz County to pull together and try it on their own eventually, whether that's in the next election cycle or for the last thing I'll say, we're actually moving forward with hopefully this continues to move forward. The Bay Area is actually trying to move forward with a regional measure, the Bay Area Housing for All, and that's the 9-county Bay Area is actually trying to move forward with a $20 billion passed on the same ballot, because they have said, look, all the 101 cities that constitute the 9-county Bay Area, they will not even get close to achieving any of their regional housing needs unless there's this kind of significant investment. So they're all in on this, as an example. So we have the Bay, LA is also mobilizing, so this is kind of in the lurking in the back. You haven't heard much about it, but hopefully in the next few months you're gonna hear a lot more about it.
There's also a statewide.
And the statewide bond? Correct.
Is this, the one you're talking about, is that the ACA one?
This is ACA 1.
Because from what I understand, that also can be used for road divisions, which of course are Santa Cruz.
Thank you for that. So ACA 1 was passed and headed on the way to the legislature. It's housing and infrastructure. And that's actually what you're saying, is that it can be for roads, it can be for transportation measures, open space, depends on what the needs are. And again, that's why the League of Cities and others are kind of excited about it, but at the same time, it can be pretty unwieldy. So we'll see where that goes.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Miriam Greenberg, or as I know her, Professor G. I had the privilege of taking my senior seminar with Professor G, where we researched housing and creating a project, and I was fortunate enough to combine my work here at Barrios with our research in the class. So in that way, we were giving a voice to the community that we serve here, which has historically been pushed out of the conversation. Miriam Greenberg is a professor of sociology at UC Santa Cruz with a research and teaching focus in critical studies of sustainability, housing, and urbanization. Her books in these areas include Branding New York, How a City in Crisis Was Sold to the World, Crisis Cities, Disaster and Redevelopment in New York and New Orleans, and The City is the Factory, New Solidarities and Spatial Tactics in an Urban Age. She has also undertaken a series of community-engaged, public-facing research projects, exploring these issues in California. These include Critical Sustainabilities, and with Steve McKay, No Place Like Home, on the experience of the affordable housing crisis in Santa Cruz County. Currently, she is an interim director of the UCSC Center of Labor and Community and co-director of the UCSC Center for Critical Urban and Environmental Studies. Together with students, colleagues, and community partners, she's developing 2 new projects. The first, WUI Research for Resilience, explores the relationship of the California housing crisis to the growth of the wildland-urban interface. The second, an anti-displacement vision for Santa Cruz, will include a displacement risk mapping tool alongside an interactive map of anti-displacement policies and visionary initiatives throughout our region. Miriam is a former planning commissioner for the city of Santa Cruz. So I'd like to welcome Miriam Greenberg.
Thank you so much, Josh, and it's a special honor to be here with Barrios Unidos, with Mane, with Josh, and others who are making this really, I think, one of the major inspirations for our city, for our region. And I just was so excited to have the opportunity to participate in this event, and that it's part of Affordable Housing Month, and anything we can do to also, and I'm hoping that this also leads to increased focus on the visionary plans that Barrios Unidos has to develop housing in this very spot where we're sitting. So yes, this is one of the projects that I'm working on now, and together with, in partnership with Community Bridges and Tenant Sanctuary, with help from some graduate students, including Elena Losada, Gregory Wilston, Julian Crown, who's an undergraduate, currently still working on the project, and Alma Villaloma, graduate student, and students from Sociology 196S Housing Justice, including Josh. So, next slide, please. And basically, you don't need to see the slide, it's depressing, but this is from the National Income Housing Coalition's Out of Reach report from 2023, when Santa Cruz metro area reached #1 as the least affordable in the country. And I actually ended up contacting this group who's been producing these reports going back to the 90s. And Santa Cruz has been in the top 10 going back to the 90s. So, you know, we've been 5, we've been 2, together with all these other coastal metro areas, and last year we got to #1. And this really inspired, next slide please, the No Place Like Home project. You know, I came from New York City to teach at UCSC, and people were like, why would an urbanist want to study Santa Cruz? It's not a city, you know, it doesn't have urban issues. And, you know, this has been one of the most important places I think that we should be studying. We should be understanding what is going on in places like Santa Cruz, which are an intensified version of what's happening across the coast of California and around the country, obviously, as well, since this is a national issue. And so we did this project. You see one of our students who was on the cover of the report here, who was camping in the woods while trying to finish her degree. And the students, it was a large-scale, community-initiated student engaged research project where we surveyed 2,000 renters and looked at 4 major issues in particular that we found from our survey that renters were facing. And we focused on renters because they're the hardest hit from the crisis, even while, of course, homeowners are struggling as well in so many cases. But renters, we found, were really understudied and very little understood, and often little represented in the census and other official reports because they're often, you know, moving in and out of this community so frequently, often also less represented at city council meetings and planning commission meetings and so forth. And so we wanted to focus on renters. And so we focused in the areas where renters were concentrated in the city of Santa Cruz, in Live Oak, in Watsonville. And we found 4 major issues in particular having to do with rent burden, including 30% rent burden, 50% extreme rent burden, and what we called obscene rent burden, which was 23% who were spending over 70% of their income on rent, as well as overcrowding, which we found far higher numbers of overcrowding than in the census as a result of students going out and really capturing renters' experiences. We found 27% rent burden, overcrowding as compared to often less than 10% in the census. And we looked at major problems with housing that people were putting up with, as well as forced moves and evictions. And next slide, please. And this became kind of a focus, actually, moving from the project, which was the forced moves and evictions, and issues of displacement. And one of the things we were seeing was that, you know, renters are so vulnerable that while a lot of these other really important initiatives are trying to get underway, are facing NIMBY opposition, are trying to scramble to assemble the financing, renters can't hold on in this community. And so we were seeing, as well as the fact that there's such a power imbalance often between landlords and renters, such that renters faced all kinds of, you know, we call them forced moves because there might not be formal evictions, but they're forced to move as a result of rent hikes and other kinds of moves by landlords to make it very difficult for people to stay in their housing. And there has been new legislation to try to protect against that, but there's all kinds of ways that we found through our survey and interviews of landlords, you know, getting around some of those regulations and those regulations not being enforced. And so we found very high levels of forced moves. And of course, we don't have rent regulations, we don't have rent control or anti-eviction measures in Santa Cruz, and so we also don't have a rent board, and it's hard to study those kinds of things, unlike in communities that have those kinds of bodies. And so we found, you know, 50% of forced moves in the community, which is one of the things that also inspired us to take on this next project that I wanted to talk about. Next slide, please. One more thing to point out is that when we talk about forced moves and evictions, the broader category we're thinking about is displacement. Issues of displacement from Santa Cruz, and we think about that in terms of 2 forms of displacement, both direct displacement of people being priced or pushed out of the community, as well as indirect displacement, which means people who can't afford to move back in are prevented from moving back in, whether it's people's children, as has been mentioned, would like to come back, after they leave, whether it's re-entry populations who have been incarcerated, whether it's people who might be coming for jobs, who are teachers and so forth, who would otherwise be living close to their jobs and not driving crazy distances. All of those folks can't afford to come in, and that's an indirect form of displacement as well. This is a map that I believe Diana will recognize and help to produce, along with Gretchen Regenhardt from California Rural Legal Assistance. This is, there's been so much discussion about how the issues we're talking about, from rent burden to overcrowding to major problems with housing to displacement, are all landing on top of and exacerbating already existing, profound, deeply historical forms of housing exclusion and segregation in this country that go back. We could go back further than the 1920s, but often people trace it to restrictive covenants, to single-family home zoning, to redlining and racial steering, followed by cuts to federal housing supports that were really consistent through the mid-part of the 20th century. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of the kind of conservative local political movements that might be in California, that might be progressive on the environment, on all kinds of lifestyle-related issues, on gender issues and so forth, but that were nonetheless profoundly conservative when it came to dealing with affordable housing and strict affordable housing provisions and block tenant protections at the local scale, including in Santa Cruz, the closure of redevelopment agencies, as has been mentioned, and the lack of funding for affordable housing at the state level. And then from the 2010s on, really increasing financialization of the housing market, the rise of Airbnb, and gentrification of lower income non-white neighborhoods in particular. And so the areas that in that map actually on the previous slide was showing was the correlation, and it's a little hard to see on the slide, but the correlation of all those little dots, which were representations of the racial demographics of Santa Cruz, on top of a zoning map, showing that the areas where there was multifamily housing, the remaining multifamily housing in Santa Cruz is concentrated in areas that are disproportionately non-white. So in Santa Cruz, in the downtown Beach Flats, Lower Ocean neighborhoods. It's a little hard to tell, but that's what that shows. And so the next slide, please. And so these histories also impact gentrification, of course, because these areas where there's multifamily housing, what is sometimes referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing, already existing in this community, are also historically low-income neighborhoods with high proportions of Latinx, in our case, residents, have the highest profit margins. So these are also targeted for investment and for Airbnb, as well as for flipping houses and breaking them into kind of beach bungalows and so forth for people who are maybe living in them in some cases, maybe having second homes or third homes, maybe renting out, maybe holding onto as an investment property. And this is a national phenomenon, but it's very prevalent in Santa Cruz, which of course has a huge tourist economy. Next slide, please. So, and this gentrification is further spurred by investments in high-end development nearby. So this is an image of the downtown development projects that that have been so important for us to be thinking about, and that we were concerned with in the Planning Commission, and yet that are right on the other side of the San Lorenzo River from Beach Flats and Lower Ocean, and you kind of see the images overlaying those neighborhoods where a lot of the speculative investment is going. And when this plan was proposed, you saw this escalation in investment activity on the other side of the river. So this really led us to be thinking, next slide please, to the importance of a kind of holistic approach to thinking about affordable housing that includes massive production of new and mostly affordable housing and missing middle housing and other forms of housing that needs to be produced alongside of preservation of already existing affordable housing and the protection of tenants. And that those things really have to be in balance, and that while we're working to really expand financing and sites and so forth, and political will behind production of new affordable housing, we need to also have these other protections in place to enable people to hold on here. And so, next slide, please. And so many communities now have anti-displacement committees and specific plans to address these issues. And I just included here San Jose, Seattle, and the city of Watsonville, that include policies that are particularly focused on just trying to strike some kind of balance. And when I was on the Planning Commission, next slide please, we were able to authorize, a vote that was, 4 out of the 7 commissioners supported the idea that we should do something similar in Santa Cruz. And so I just raised this because, we were trying to figure out how to get, this was coinciding with the downtown plan. In order to minimize potential impact of the proposed plan on additional displacement of affordable housing within the plan area and its surrounding areas, particularly beach flats and lower ocean, an advisory committee of residents and affordable housing experts shall be formed to study and recommend effective mitigation measures in coordination with the Planning Commission. You can read the minutes. That was never created. However, next slide please, we decided to take it on. It was authorized, we were going to try to do it. So this is what we've been doing. And faculty, students, and community partners are creating an anti-displacement vision for Santa Cruz, recognizing the need for research on displacement to inform policy and planning, and a mix of methods from displacement risk mapping to anti-displacement policy analysis and ethnographies or storytelling on displacement to inform that research. Next slide, please. So, one of the first things we started with was thinking about stories of displacement. And out of the No Place Like Home project, we ended up doing all these interviews with folks. Alma Villaloma, who actually was an undergraduate involved in No Place Like Home, went to UCLA in urban planning, came back as a graduate student, stayed in touch with a number of the people that she interviewed. And that was this really remarkable repository of stories, because it's actually incredibly hard to study people who've been displaced because they're displaced, and where do they go? And so she and others of our students stayed in touch with people, and then we used snowball sampling, and we were able to keep in touch with a lot of people who have been displaced to understand both kind of what their experience of displacement was and how they created new homes outside of Santa Cruz, and the degree to which they tried to stay connected to Santa Cruz in so many cases, and felt that this was kind of like their primary home even while they had to move. And this is the story of Kati, who works for Boys and Girls Club, was born and raised in Santa Cruz, and this is her trajectory from Capitola to Scotts Valley to Zayante and close to Lompico, and all kinds of stories about trying to keep her daughter in schools here, and so many of her friends who've moved even further away, as a result of which she feels quite lucky. Next slide, please. Kuka is another story of someone who moved much further from Santa Cruz. Kuka lived in Santa Cruz, originally from Michoacan, Mexico, and had moved here as a teenager and had lived here for decades, I think for 25 years, had created a family here, was primarily employed as a house cleaner and also worked in restaurants. And she ultimately, with her family, moved to Bakersfield after many moves, after starting as, in her apartment on Ocean and Leonard Street, and had many memories of, living close to the boardwalk and the quality of life that she had for her family, and was connected to community bridges and the Nova Vista Family Resource Center, and was really a leader at the Family Resource Center. And now is finding her life is so much calmer. She doesn't have to work 3 or 4 jobs. She's living in Bakersfield, but she still very much misses the community that she created and that she raised her family within in Santa Cruz. Next slide, please. So we wanted to figure out a way for people to understand how the risk of displacement was affecting different communities in the city. And there are other examples of mapping projects that do this. We are a small city, we're a small town, so we were looking for a method that enabled us to look at small cities. The Urban Displacement Project at Berkeley, for instance, is using census tract data and I won't get into the details of it, but we would only have 2 census tracts in Santa Cruz, so we found methods to kind of focus in at a smaller scale. And this is a study that looked at different methods to study Boston, and we looked at all kinds of different ways you could study displacement at the local scale. Next slide, please. We came up with a displacement risk index of population vulnerability, gentrification-related demographic change, and housing market appreciation. And a combination of this formed our index of recognizing degree of displacement risk in different parts of Santa Cruz, and we were influenced particularly by Professor Lisa Bates from University of Oregon in Portland. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we came up with a typology of displacement risk, including potential risk, imminent risk, active displacement, continued loss, and a neighborhood that is so exclusive that there's no one really being actively displaced to the same degree because it's already become exclusionary. And combining those 3 key variables of vulnerability, demographic change, i.e. increasing the change from and the loss in particular of non-white population and people of color, and also loss of low-income population, as well as housing market appreciation in areas proximate to as well as within the neighborhood. Next slide, please. And so from this, we came up with a map looking at displacement risk. And you can see that the areas that are kind of light pink, have potential risk of displacement, are kind of medium, are imminent, and third is active, and then continued loss and exclusive. And this is a kind of zoom in on downtown Beach Flats, Lower Ocean neighborhood. Next slide, please. And so we're going to create this story map where you can kind of explore what's going on in particular tracts and sort of what the issues are. And these are just examples of places where you see active displacement in the Metro Center downtown area going on. You see Beach Flats is at potential risk of displacement, a little less intense than is currently happening in the downtown area. The Santa Cruz Harbor is already an exclusive neighborhood, and housing costs are rising quickly, and historically affluent residents that live in the neighborhood maintain a stronghold. So it's, so there's different kinds of sensitivities when one thinks about where development is going to go. Next slide, please. This is an overlay of Airbnb. Active Airbnbs, this is from September 2023, we could update it. This indicates 250 short-term rental permits in Santa Cruz, but this is a little background context, but 1,700 active short-term rentals despite only 250 permits. So you can do the math on that, of which 600 are likely full-time short-term rentals as opposed to home shares. So next slide, please. This is an overlay of the sites inventory from the city. And these are color-coded in blue to indicate moderate to high income. And the size of the circle indicates the number of units. So a large concentration of market rate housing going into areas. There are along corridors, which we were talking about is super important, but there's also a lot going into some of the highest risk areas for displacement, where there are also a high concentration of Airbnbs and where it's also, of course, a great investment opportunity. Next slide, please. These are the low income to moderate income units, also along corridors, and a smaller number going into the higher risk areas. And we would argue that in particular developments that are mostly large, 70 and above low income, and or 100% low income or affordable are not going to have that kind of displacement risk. And there's all kinds of discussions we could have about concepts of filtering and concepts of what the income impact is for the impact is for high income developments. But the concern is that in the short term, it can lead to this kind of gentrification and speculative investment pressure that again can have these displacing effects in the absence of other kinds of policies around preservation and protection. there's a star there at the Dream Inn because we gave a presentation along these lines to the Coastal Commission that was having its meeting at the Dream Inn. So we were talking about this in the neighborhood in particular. And the Coastal Commission actually, this is a longer conversation, but they're actually really interested in these issues along the coast right now. They're kind of shifting back to what was their traditional focus when they were created, a mandate that was actually stripped from their authority, which had to do with protecting affordability on the coast. Next slide. And there's Barrios Unidos in the neighborhood that it's in. And you can see that it's right across the street from an already exclusionary neighborhood. And it is alongside of one with active displacement. And so, this is an approximation. It's not like the issues like stop at SoCal Avenue, and there's but it's to indicate that there's a lot of these kinds of dynamics going on in proximity to barrios. And next slide, please. These are Airbnbs. And next slide, please. These are the already planned by the city low-income units, and there's very small little dots to show that it's, that's between 1 and 70, often that's between 3 and 5 units. Next slide, please. These are the market rate units that are going in across the way and in the area around. And next slide, please. So really, the idea is that we need to be thinking strategically about the neighborhoods where we're developing. We need to have a broad, holistic, anti-displacement vision for policy and planning that balances the need for expansion and enforcement of regulations to preserve affordability and protect tenants alongside expanded support for the providers and production of affordable and social housing by state, by nonprofits, by employers, by unions, by social movements. Everyone who can build should be building, and that we should be balancing those efforts with movements as well as policies to protect tenants and preserve already existing affordable housing. And when we talk about the 3 Ps, there's also, of course, a 4th P, which is politics, and which is the need to build power in order to protect those who often have the least voice in these stories, which are not only renters, but also those who are informally housed and unhoused in our community. And so, next slide, Barrios Unidos' new building is super important in the story. It's a shining example of the kind of housing we need to be building and the kind of movement behind that housing. And next slide, please. So thank you. I'm really excited for this project.
Yes, I asked about the, what was it called? It was called the Justice for Renters Initiative.
Justice for Renters Initiative, and is that the one that's supposed to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act?
That is correct.
Okay, so raise your hand if you know something about Costa-Hawkins. Okay, so those of us that know that was 1995, and it was basically a little revolution of the apartment association folks and realtors, everybody else basically said, you know what, we want to squash any kind of rent control. And there was a little bit of a, kind of a compromise, basically said, look, in anything newer than 1995, basically you can't have rent control as we know it. It's got to be older than that, and there's something called, and it can't be for single family homes, and there's vacancy decontrol, which means that if somehow there's an ordinance that applies to that unit, right, that's older than 1995, as soon as somebody moves out of that unit, then the property owner can rent it at market rate. So that's vacancy decontrol, okay? So those are kind of the major tenets. There's probably some other stuff, but those are the major things that since 1995, that's the lay of the land. So that accounts for the reason why there's not that many rent control ordinances across the state, right? Most of what you see are older things that have been kind of tweaks around the edges. There's been some improvements around how some of, maybe in San Jose or Santa Monica, some of these, East Palo Alto, right? So there's some more prolific ordinances. But the bottom line is that now it's been 30 years, And we know based on the data we just heard, especially, things are not getting that much better. They're getting really, really intense. And so I know that it failed by a little over 60% last time it was on the ballot. So there's a concerted effort to see a showdown again because things are getting more intense. There is a lot more organizing statewide. So we'll see if it goes forward. The last time this came up, when I was asked, me personally, I'm for it in terms of making sure that we try to put more tools in the toolbox for renters. Just as what Professor Greenberg said, the power dynamic is very vivid, right? Landlords have more and more power and control than they ever have. And kudos to them. If you own property, great. But if you're a renter, then God bless you, good luck. And so I think that we need to have more tools to try to counterbalance that. I see this as an opportunity. And it doesn't guarantee anything. This just wipes that out and says, okay, let's get on our time machine and act like 1995 didn't happen so that we can deal with the problems that are in 2024.
It takes so long and it's so expensive to develop a few affordable housing rentals. It seems like something we got to add to the toolbox of housing advocates is try to address more regions who may want to add 10,000 more students to UCSC. I don't know if that's still current, but that's quite an impact on the rental market if UCSC doesn't absorb them on campus housing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an important point. And it's not, I think there's a variety of reasons for the fact that we were just actually talking about this before the panel with Julie about the history of the kind of town gown issues in Santa Cruz and the fact that the city of Santa Cruz has not always wanted Santa Cruz to develop off its own campus. And now I'm excited that there will be a new development off of Delaware. And of course, there's also issues on our own campus of folks who oppose development, even while we have slated new dormitories on our campus. There's been a lot of opposition and lawsuits to those. And so we've kind of faced, unlike other UCs, we have had a slew of lawsuits when we've tried to pass our long-term development plans. Unlike Irvine, unlike Merced, it's kind of this ongoing joke every time we try to pass one of these. But as Julie said, I think that that is changing. I think that the fact that this Delaware development is happening is a really great sign. It's going to be on a transit corridor. We are one of the reasons why the metro is still functioning in Santa Cruz. Our students ride all the buses, keep it in operation, and of course our campus subsidizes transit. The point about the need for housing for singles, seniors, and students on corridors is something that we have long fought to support. And so when I was on the Planning Commission, the campus would kind of often be almost like a silent partner, or not a partner necessarily, but a supporter of 831 water or whatever the project might be, because our students would be in a lot of those units, those small units, and alongside the need for people who are small families or who are seniors. But if we went to, my understanding was from talking to folks on campus, going to city council, if the campus was represented, people in often, certain areas would be opposed to it because of the campus. The campus is the largest employer. Our staff needs housing desperately, our faculty as well. So anyway, I think it's a combined issue of the need for our campus to be able to develop, the need also for the UC to support housing and to support its students, more so in terms of basic needs, as well as the town.
I'd like to supplement that a little bit. I actually had the pleasure of joining a conversation, a quick tour of Cresby Home.
Yes, which is beautiful.
Beautiful,
Yes,
it's under development, and there's cranes in the air, so
Yes,
it's
I'm
pretty.
teaching there right now.
So it's
Okay.
very, very exciting. I was in the hall too, so I'll have to come by and
It's
see you.
gorgeous, yes.
But a couple statistics that I wrote down from the tour, I actually took a little bit of notes. So 19,000 students-ish, 57% live on campus, and that leads the UC.
It's the top of the museum.
And then another stat was that there's about 1,600 students on waiting lists. So the demand is there
Yes.
of really wanting to have that. And then there's about 3,000 student beds that are kind of in the pipeline to address that ongoing, the current need and then the waiting list situation. So it looks like there's a lot of movement on campus to continue to ensure that the freshmen, as an example, are basically guaranteed, pretty much all of the freshmen are guaranteed. It's 98% of Frosh live on campus.
That's right, yeah.
So there's a lot of things that the campus is doing to really continue to keep to minimize the pressure to the community. So just want to applaud the UC-SC for making these incredible strides.
Yeah, yeah.
Student side that I've encountered, it sounds like the cost of the living on campus is very high, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of students crammed into small spaces on top of each other.
Yes.
Yeah, so why can't there be affordable?
Yes, I think that's such a good point. And if there are students here who would like to comment on that. My understanding is that often landlords in town peg their rents to the cost of housing on campus. And we can see how high the rents are in town, and they can just go a little underneath what it can be on campus. And so, like I was saying, there isn't sufficient support for basic needs, including housing. To the degree that there's support for basic needs, it's often in terms of food. There's been great progress made in terms of food insecurity, and insufficient on campus, yeah, and insufficient in terms of support for housing throughout the UC, as well as on our campus. And I think that speaks to the kind of corporatization of the university, the shift away from support of basic needs, the increasing tuition, the move away from the contract for public higher education in California, the lack of Proposition 13. I mean, we can go on and on. So, but I think that we've just seen this precipitous decline, even while enrollments and tuition has gone up, decline in state support for the university. And so it's kind of, it's this interesting part and parcel situation where one of the reasons why students identify so much with local area renters and were interested in forming movements together with them is because they've been seeing the same impact and going into increasing debt, both in terms of their housing costs as well as the cost of their education. Yeah. So I agree that there needs to be better support throughout the system.
So I built some housing actually in Mountain View, and there was one source that actually came really from a fund put out by Stanford University. So they wound up in this whole discussion around and negotiation around could they build additional educational facilities because there was an impact to traffic, there's an impact to housing. And so they created this sort of fund that actually allowed us to create more affordable housing. I think it's great that UC Santa Cruz is actually building enough housing for the students, which hopefully will give some relief, or trying to the supply, because I know people personally who were students at Santa Cruz and just they could not find a place. And of course, you've already heard about this one student that was camping because they couldn't find an affordable place to live.
There's a lot.
And what's that? Many students. And I know at San Jose State, when I was at First Community, there was a lack of acknowledgement, I think, at San Jose State about the homeless issues, yet one of the interns that we employed was homeless and was letting people crash in the apartment when they finally, because they had empathy. So I think it's, with any large employer, having a jobs housing balance and thinking about what are the nexus of, okay, we're creating these great facilities, you have additional students, there's going to be more support required. What kinds of things mitigate that kind of an impact as well? What other things could the institution do to help with supply, which is already tough?
My issues are not as community conscious. I am a combat veteran, and a lot of my comrades, brothers and sisters, they're homeless. Those that are supported by the VA are in those 95 bad housing, where every time you look around and get an apartment, they move in, the next vet that comes in, the rent goes up on them. Now, my question is, taking it away from the city, the state, the county, the VA is willing to accommodate these men and women if I had gentlemen like yourself support. As I shared with Jeff, I've been on this trek fighting since 2018. And when you mentioned your color issue, you know, I saw it. It wasn't as blatant as what they said to you, but basically the developers and that community, as an independent with no background, all I have is I'm a combat veteran, and my brothers and sisters need help in housing. And when I proposed 100% affordable, that was like, excuse me, wait a minute, Jar, did you have something? And I was kind of like this slid aside, and I understood it because it's about money. But these men and women put their lives on the line, and a lot of them are disabled physically, right? And all we get is 100%, which is about $37 a month, right? We can't afford the rent. I was paying 70% on rent, okay? My question is, can I get y'all's help in putting something together that would stand the course?
So, Wesley, I really appreciate that, and thank you for your service. I've been involved in building housing for veterans. You know, there was a funding source the state provided that they're proposing to cut. And I think what that tells me is that if we're, as a community, trying to take control of creating the housing that's needed. I've also worked for folks with developmental disabilities, with folks that suffer, you know, from mental illness, and we, as a community, Santa Cruz has to take ownership. And if there are ways of doing things like AC1, if that passes, imagine the thousands of units that could have been built if that bond measure had passed, right? You mentioned 1,000 units. So I don't know that we one of the blessings is our district happens to be where Speaker Rivas is. I know Matt knows Speaker Rivas. He's from this, it's a very unique time to put that kind of pressure on with respect to veterans. He has a picture on his wall in his office of a paycheck from his father where he could support a home. I forget how much the paycheck was, $6 something an hour way back when. And he wants to make things more affordable. So it's a good time to bring those things up, and yet we're still wrestling with this budget. I think the best way to do it is acting locally to try and create those sources and just really emphasizing how important that is to own it. And for us, I'm always going to try and support veterans and everyone I can and build as many houses as I can.
I do have to give credit to Santa Cruz because I'm a peer support specialist. And in Monterey, the 100%ers, those men and women that put their lives on the line, they couldn't get the HUD badge because they were $200 over the threshold. And thank God for Santa Cruz. I brought them to Santa Cruz and we got them housed here because it's 100,000 versus Monterey. But nevertheless, we need assistance and we need housing.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. appreciate that, bringing that up. So yeah, all kinds of different housing types are needed. Thank you for lifting up the veteran housing piece. I know that recently in the last few years there was a really strong project that was built, and I'm looking at you because you're the project manager.
Jackson Street. Anyway, Jackson Street is currently under construction and has 22 units set aside for veterans with vouchers on them. That is currently under construction in the city of Santa Cruz. And there's also Veterans Village that is also complete or under construction. I forget what the status of that one is. That is also veterans housing in Big Scotts Valley or other area. Belton, thank you.
And I hear that, but I'm speaking, as I shared with Jeff, specifically for us that were incumbent. Our income does not afford us the American dream. And I believe we, more than anyone, because it's on our backs that you're able to go to a restaurant and not worry about any kind of crazy stuff. We deserve the American dream. And that's where I'm coming from. Not housing with HUD badge. I'm talking about the 100%ers that were there in all the conflicts. You know, if we can fight for the freedom, I think we deserve the American dream. And I was blessed because, as I shared with Jeff, I tried it with the city of Monterey, and I bought a one-bedroom condo for 49% below market rate. But I was 100 on that list, and that included not just veterans, but the public that fit the criteria. And I'm just saying that we deserve the American dream. And we represent, in Monterey and Santa Cruz, I think there's 1,500 of us that have 100%. You know, so that's not to take away what's going on, because I've been running around trying to get this for us, and I see everything that you said. I'm like, wow, I wasn't dreaming. These guys are really, you know, working towards a different project. And Jeff, I see your work all over the place. And I wish I can mimic you through your tutoring.
Okay, hope we can mimic it a lot better. We need a lot more.
Yeah.
I had, I guess, a two-part question for Professor Greenberg. Earlier you had a slide up that showed a number of projects that I guess could lead to gentrification and displacement on Santa Cruz. One of those was the Pacific Station project, which is 100% affordable. So the question related to that is if that wasn't, if I'm not misreading the slide, do you believe that 100% affordable projects can contribute to gentrification and displacement in communities? And then the sort of follow-up question related to your work in general is, you know, I think we all recognize that we're in a housing crisis. I believe we have a shortage of millions of homes in the state of California, and we heard earlier about the lack of funding to subsidize affordable housing, and how we're just sort of creeping along with a little bit of market rate production and a little bit of subsidized housing. In the city of Santa Cruz, we've actually built more affordable housing than market rate housing over the last 8 years. But my question is, if market rate housing is leading towards gentrification and displacement, the little bit that we're producing now, would your suggestion be for us to stop producing that at all in order to reduce the risk of gentrification and displacement, or would that continue anyway without the market rate production?
Thanks for the question. So the dots that I showed were from the planning department, and it's the site's inventory of things that are in the pipeline. And the yellow ones were the ones that were low to moderate income. They didn't include in there, but I think it might have been folded in. They gave us the data, extremely low income. And yeah, to your first question, I definitely think that 100% affordable and majority affordable, like, you know, upwards of some, studies, the recent study by Karen Chappell at Berkeley and the University of Toronto is that upwards of 70 is not going to have the same kind of displacing effects, and certainly 100% affordable. And so the question is how to have a mix is one part of that. And currently, of the sites inventory, 30% of the units in the pipeline are affordable in that low to moderate versus 70% that are in the market rate. And so how would we flip that might be one question. But in addition, there's the question of where things are going. And one of the goals of the map is to think about where things are being located. So if there's going to be a gentrifying effect of market rate development, why don't we put it in already exclusionary areas? Why are we putting it in areas that are at risk of displacement? If we know that in proximity to those developments, there's a more likely, proximal investment and, speculative investment. So that's one thing I would say. The other is that what regulations are accompanying that market rate development? How do we know that so many of these market rate units in downtown are not just going to be turned into Airbnbs? How do we know that they're going to be housing folks? What are the regulations accompanying that investment in that development? All of the amenities that are going into this area that are raising the property values. How is that also, understood to be accompanied by, efforts to ensure that people are going to be able to get into those units and hold on to those units? Is one of the questions that we also are interested in. And then finally, how could some of the funding so one thing is, to Matt's point about some of the measures might be non-budgetary. There might be measures that would simply ensure that we can protect tenants, right? Another would be that some of the housing fund monies and other monies could go towards preserving very, very vulnerable multifamily housing that is currently being flipped and turned into speculative investments and displacing people. So we're seeing a net loss while these buildings are going up, even with inclusionary units in them and so forth. All of these people are being protected. How can we think in the short and medium term, while those things are in the pipeline, of protecting people who are currently here and using funds to do so?
I just want to be conscious of time. We're a little over time. Folks are free to stay and ask questions as long as it's okay with the speakers. But I want to give one last